Okay.
Hey everybody, this is Dan,
And this is Ron.
and this is the Anomaly Questionable Movies podcast. Today we have a very special guest, CARL ROLLYSON, who has written a lot of biographies, a lot of stuff on biography. He's an expert on numerous figures, including Lillian Hellman, Rebecca West, uh, Marilyn Monroe,
William
Faulkner, and for the purposes of today's episode, Norman Mailer, because we watched Maidstone, which I remembered enjoying when I first saw it 10 years ago. Now it looks kind of like it's a weird movie, but I figured having Carl on to explain maybe some of the background and I just figure you probably got some interesting insights on this because you've definitely spent a lot more time looking into Mailer than probably almost anybody on the planet. So, yeah. So what did you think of the movie this time?
Well, I just watched it yesterday again. It's been my first version of my Mailer biography came out in 1991. And then I did an update. I changed the title, calling it Norman Mailer, The Last Romantic. But I haven't watched the film really, I don't think, since the 1990s. And I remember, too, that it was hard to get a hold of when I was writing the biography. And I was relying a lot on the script, which was published.
So there was a script.
There was, well, I think there was a script based on the actual film, if you see what I mean. I don't think they were shooting from a script, but I think that someone, watched the film and made a script out of it, so to speak, along with Mailer's comments about making film. As to what I think about it, I was kind of surprised in a way. It's a more disturbing film than I remembered. It made me anxious in a way, and I think in a good way, in the way that even much better movies will make a viewer. And I want to say right off the bat that Maidstone, I don't think you can judge it by any conventional standards. He certainly didn't set out, it's not like he wanted to make a conventional film and made a mess out of it. But I think we come to film, and that was sort of Mailer's point, we come to film with certain expectations. One, that a film does have a script. It might be partly improvised. I don't think there was any script going in for Maidstone at all. I think he had a concept, he had an idea. Not so different really in a way from, Larry David getting together with a bunch of actors for his series. Curb Your Enthusiasm.
That's funny. We brought up the Larry David thing last night when we were watching it.
The actors know, and they're professionals, so they really know how to go with it in a way that some of these amateurs or non-actors in Mailer's Maidstone didn't. But it interests me, both as a film scholar and also as a biographer. And I think it's a very daring film. It's a film which there are periods where people are just looking at one another, and you don't expect that in a film. In other words, it doesn't seem to have the sense of timing that films have, even though it is an edited film.
Right. It's like you saw Faces by John Cassavetes and threw out all the plot stuff. It's just like 20 minutes of reaction shots with no object of reaction.
But I think the film has a point, and I think a really interesting one. I would call it a Brechtian film. It's self-reflexive. We're never allowed to forget that this is Norman Mailer playing the main character, Norman Kingsley. And in fact, Kingsley is Mailer's middle name. And although he's playing a film director, directing a film, and he had done other films before Maidstone, he's, of course, not known as a film director. Wasn't known then as a film director, isn't known now, certainly primarily as a film director. We never forget that it's Mailer. And that really comes to a climax, really a crisis at the end of the film when the actor Rip Torn attacks him. And that's what I mean by the film makes me uneasy, because I think Rip Torn was right. There was a kind of air of menace in the air. The way the way Mailer is, I've got Faulkner on the brain, my last book, the way Mailer treats women, I would imagine both women and men watching this film, it would make them uneasy because he's cruel. He talks about them, they're physically, even when he calls a woman beautiful, you could be annoyed or irritated or offended by the way he does it. That's all deliberate. It's all Mailer, but it is also his character that he's playing. And the point about this character is supposedly a bunch of men are getting together thinking about running this Norman Kingsley for president because he's got name recognition, because he is a respected filmmaker. But there are a lot of things about Norman Kingsley. For instance, there are rumors about him perhaps having homosexual relationships. There are various biographical details which are surprising when you think of Norman Mailer because of the sort of the macho, masculine image that he has. So there's that. And then there are these unsettling scenes, like the one where this woman who the director, Norman Kingsley, has supposedly been involved with, he's told she's come back to visit him, much to his surprise. And they have a scene where she says almost nothing. She just looks at him and he begins to scat sing, do da da da,
Right.
And that
which is another
really
very Cassavetes moment, right? Like
yeah,
there's that moment in Husbands where they're all just drunk singing in the bar for 10 minutes.
Yeah, but it's very unsettling. It's like, is he courting her? Is he taunting her? Is he trying to get a reaction out of her? And that's where the film is really playing, I think, with, when we watch a film, a film is not like life. It sets up certain expectations, which in some way have to be fulfilled. And that's why, again, at the end of the film, Rip Torn when he attacks Mailer with a hammer, and actually does hit him with a hammer. I don't think all that hard, but he does draw blood. It's because he's sort of saying, Norman Mailer, you don't have the guts to really follow through on this character, Norman Kingsley, who people earlier in the film have said, should we get rid of this guy? Because he's so unpredictable. And at one point, he does say of himself, that is, and who's talking? It's Norman Mailer, but it's also Kingsley, saying, it's hard to trust me because I'm not conventional in any sense. I'm unpredictable. And of course, that was Mailer too. I mean, you never knew what was going to happen when he showed up at a public event or when he threw a party for himself. This is a fellow who stabbed his wife. Some people can't get over that, his second wife. But I think he uses all that in the film in a curious way, constantly. And that's why I use Brecht, because Brecht doesn't want us to use Coleridge's phrase, he doesn't want us to suspend our disbelief. He wants that disbelief. He, as I say, he wants us to see Norman Mailer even as we're watching Norman Kingsley. So it's a kind of comment on what art makes us do, in a sense. It's this cross, almost art and life at cross purposes. And I think the film actually captures that in really interesting ways. Saying all that, I can't say it's an easy film to watch. I think most people watching it, even people with a film scholars or a history of film and so on, would find it a very difficult film to watch. And yet, as I say, the unpredictability of it was maintained. If there's a consistency in the film, that's it. He uses his ex-wives. They're all, if you know his biography, there are things about the film where you can see he's probing really aspects of his own Mailer persona.
Well, the woman
character.
talking into the microphone periodically, where she's got the camera on her, kind of. That's one of Mailer's ex-wives, right?
Yeah. Her name escapes me at the moment. She's English. It'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, yes, that's one of his wives. They only were married about 13 months. And like a lot of his wives, these were tempestuous marriages, lots of quarrels and fights and divorces and so on. And yet most of the women he was married to, another ex-wife is in the film Beverly Bentley, for example, who was an actress, they come back, not just for Maidstone, but I mean, they came back for family gatherings. At a Mailer party, you might see 4 of his wives. He was,
Wow.
and he had this brood of children.
That's like one way to build a Rolodex.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So I don't know if I'm making sense of this film, but I've been thinking about this a lot because recently I wrote a piece. It's for an academic volume that's coming out called Norman Mailer in Context, which is published by Cambridge University Press. And I wrote about Mailer's interest in Marilyn Monroe, which I do in the biography, of course, since he wrote a biography of her. But I was invited to do this by a Mailer scholar and also another Mailer biographer, J. Michael Lennon. And he happened to mention that he had the script of a play Mailer wrote that's never been published. It's called Strawhead. And it was actually done as a workshop play at the Actors Studio, starring Mailer's daughter as Marilyn. Now, I didn't get a chance to see this, but he sent me the script, and I was floored by the script. It's better than Maidstone. It really is a play, and it was workshopped. And from one of the workshops, he rewrote some of Strawhead, and it's like Maidstone in the sense that it's, again, Brechtians. It's about an actress attempting to play Marilyn Monroe, which works better that way than an actress actually trying to convince you she is Marilyn Monroe, if you see what I mean. Every biopic of Marilyn Monroe ultimately turns out to be a disappointment. I don't know if you saw it, but there was this TV series called Smash. And the first season...
Is that the one with Michelle Williams playing Marilyn Monroe, or was that a different movie?
I think it's a different one. Yeah, that's a different one. I don't remember the two. There were 2 actresses vying for the role of Marilyn. And what was interesting about it, it was all about their approaches to the character. I found that absolutely fascinating. The series worked wonderfully for the first season. Then they went on and they did subplots because they weren't getting enough of an audience, and it got silly and ridiculous. But the first season was, again, kind of Brechtian. It was kind of like, let's talk about how do you, and obviously to a biographer, this is fascinating. How do you inhabit somebody else's character? How do you get into somebody else's mind and imagination? And there was Mailer, both in Strawhead. Shelley Winters had said in the Actors Studio when Strawhead was performed, she made some criticisms of Mailer. He incorporated it right in the play. He doesn't identify her as Shelley Winters, the actress, but he has a woman stand up and say, what you just wrote was bullshit, and she has an argument with the director who's a character in the play Strawhead. So Mailer is, again, working at the same sort of fascinated look at, what is art, what is life, what roles do we play and perform, and how do we study that? How do we expose that?
And I think that's like a place where the Maidstone, the movie, crosses over with a lot of his writing, in that a sense I got with Mailer is that, kind of like Larry David, he has a very underdeveloped sense of other minds. So he's using a lot of stuff that just literally people said to him, or he's creating situations where other people can kind of act as this like outside self-awareness that he seems to be afraid that he doesn't actually have and
Yeah,
may
that's
not
very
have.
Yeah, that's very astute. He often had doubts about himself as a creator of fictions. His ability to create human character, and it was very difficult for him. After the only time he did it was the Naked and the Dead, and he felt that that was really a kind of pastiche of Dos Passos and Hemingway and other Faulkner and other writers. And he moved in another direction, and he moved to this kind of self-referential direction, which
Like
in
almost
part he was.
like gonzo journalism before.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot there with Hunter Thompson, with people of that generation. Mailer really, I think that's one of the reasons Mailer was able to go into journalism, cover the political conventions, for example. That was 20 years before Mailer's time in the 30s or 40s. Other than someone like Rebecca West, one of my other biographical subjects, you didn't have novelists, literary people covering political conventions. And even Rebecca West covered the Republican Convention in 1948 in a very journalistic, much more brilliantly than most journalists could do, but nevertheless in a very journalistic way, and didn't really present herself as a character in that kind of political coverage. And Mailer, once he becomes famous after The Naked and the Dead, after 1948, it allows him, in a sense, some people would say it indulges him to present himself as part of a character in these fictions, whether he's writing nonfiction or fiction.
And fame definitely, for someone who already has this kind of issue of not necessarily fully accepting or understanding what other people think of them, that's got to be an incredibly disorienting experience. That's like hip hop artists. The first record is always about how they're not making any money, but this record's going to make them some money. And then the second record is like, I can't relate to any of my existence because I made the money.
Yes, yeah. He was very worried about that. He wasn't so much worried about fame per se. I think he enjoyed fame, but he did worry about, in a sense, his own authenticity. And therefore, as with Maidstone, he puts himself in risky situations so that he doesn't really know. We don't really know, just like he doesn't really know how it's going to turn out. And at the end of the film, in Maidstone, part of his anger stems from a couple things. One, in a sense, he seems to be feeling in a way that Rip Torn has done something just awful. He's attacked Mailer in front of his children, and he's traumatized Mailer's children. And Mailer reacts like a father. That you should not have done this. And Rip Torn keeps saying, the film is going this way. You saw me. You knew I had this hammer in my hand. You knew what I was going to do. And Mailer doesn't really answer that. But when Mailer went into the editing room,
he says right at the beginning, "I'm not putting this in the movie."
Yeah,
and you're watching it in the movie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because once he got into the editing room and had, in a sense, some objectivity, when the hammer was no longer on his head, and he was trying to put together a film, he realized without that final scene, where does the film go? If there weren't that final scene, you really would say, well, it is just a chaotic mess. Now, some people would say it's a chaotic mess anyway, but I think it's something more than a chaos. I think it's creative chaos, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I also think someone watching this to make it relevant to people who might not even be interested in Mailer particularly, or would find a hard time watching this film. I think it does say an interesting thing about politics, about how the old guard, these men sit around and are thinking, we got to come up with something new. And then what's the new is this director, Norman Kingsley. But can we trust him? He's
right. He's like
so
a non-political figure. He's a celebrity. That's what made me think of this, because a friend sent me the clip of the hammer fight. Right. And I hadn't thought about this movie in 10 years. I was like, oh, wait, Mailer is sort of like if Donald Trump could string together sentences. Like there's got to be some kind of insight here.
That's right. I think Mailer anticipates that kind of phenomenon. I mean, it starts really with Ronald Reagan. But even, we're talking about in 1960s Maidstone. Ronald Reagan is governor of California, and at the time, people, they knew he was a contender, but people really didn't believe Ronald Reagan would ever be elected president. That seemed, not just an actor, but a second-rate actor. How it turns out second-rate works better than first-rate in politics.
It's more relatable.
Yeah. So on the one hand, this is where I think it's prophetic of Trump in a way. on the one hand, you're gravitated, and many Republicans were gravitated to someone like Trump, or in the movie Norman T. Kinsley, because he's different. In other words, what do people say who still like Trump? Oh, he speaks his own mind. He's not conventional in any way. He says what he thinks, etc.
Right. It's like this evaluation of social cueing entirely from the perspective of, like, the primary thing being valued is the sense that the other person is not seeking their approval in some kind of dramatic fashion.
Right. And Kingsley seems to fit the bill. But as soon as they select him, that's when you get to talk about killing him. Because, it seemed like a good idea, and yet how the hell can they really conclude we can't control this guy. We have to put the hammer to him, which is why Rip Torn sees the logic of this. You also get, though, this Mailer did have charisma. He was married 6 times. And
he's got such a strange accent too. Like, he's constantly speaking. It's like half Brooklyn Jewish kid, half continental stage accent.
Exactly. He when he was in the Army during World War II, he got very fond of Southerners and Southern accents. So he could slip into a Southern accent. He's also very fond of the Irish, as he sees the Irish, which is Irish are urban toughs. And he was this nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn. And so he completely remade himself. But what you get in the film is almost a kind of schizophrenia, because he does speak in all these different accents. And he doesn't just do it for the film. He would do it all the time. Depending on his mood, he would slip into an Irish or a Southern or almost an English accent. His father, by the way, Barney, came from South Africa. So Mailer grew up hearing these different accents in Brooklyn and elsewhere. But I think that's where the film today still touches a nerve, I think. In the film, Norman Kingsley is attacked. I've always expected at some point, there was one moment when Trump was running for president when they hustled him off the stage. I don't know that he was in that much danger. Right. I've been surprised that he was able to get through his presidency without a significant violent attack. That certainly happened in our political pasts. And
right. So that happened to Reagan.
Yes, exactly. And there's something much more, on the surface at least, more maniacal about Trump than about Reagan. So the film has its points to make.
Oh yeah. Well, and I think that the reason I found it so interesting 10 years ago, although last night it's a chaotic jumble with some very interesting moments. I think it's sort of like it's almost like the last not the Last Picture Show, the last movie, that Dennis Hopper thing where he just took a bunch of drugs, was living out of a pool, and the whole thing's just sort of like debauched vacation footage cut together randomly. And but I think he almost it's like John Cassavetes pulled a fast one on him, because he's trying to make like that whole speech he gives at the end as Norman Mailer. I've seen interview clips with Cassavetes where he's drunk in a bar and he's saying almost the exact same things, except Cassavetes would actually script his movies. He just found out that it was a better marketing ploy to say they were completely improvised. He'd go over things with the actors constantly, and I can't tell if Mailer is taking the Cassavetes approach at face value, because it's very obvious from this movie he was borderline obsessed with, at the very least, faces. And Husbands, I could see Mailer sitting in a movie theater watching Husbands over and over again. Or is he trying to one up Cassavetes in terms of I can make a movie is it a machismo thing? Is it I could actually do this thing that Cassavetes is saying he's doing, and then you end up with Maidstone?
I don't know. What I can say is, as far as I remember, he didn't really say much, if anything, about Cassavetes. Now, with some writers, when they don't say anything at all about a contemporary, it's probably because they're hiding something. That there's something really important about that writer that they just don't want to admit has anything to do with them. Mailer, by and large, was not like that. In other words, whoever the competition was, he was going to talk about them and explain their limitations.
Oh, yeah, that's a lot of the appeal of Mailer as a public figure, is that he's kind of like tailor-made for celebrity, because he loved starting shit with like anybody and everybody. That's why he and Gore Vidal got into so much trouble, because they were very much alike in that respect. They didn't mind insulting their contemporaries and right to the contemporaries' faces. That was no problem at all. Right. I remember you showed us that clip of the two of them on I think it was Dick Cavett.
Yes.
Class once, and like Mailer's literally putting up boxing fisticuffs for half the interview.
Yeah, it's true. And also Mailer is a wannabe. I don't even think it's Cassavetes per se, but he did want to be a movie director. He put in quite a good bit of his own money into this production and his other productions. And later in life, he plays Stanford White in Ragtime. The Czech director, gave him, he's Stanford White. And he was just thrilled to do that. I mean, it's a small, short scene, but it's an important scene. I just thought of the name of his English wife, Lady Jean Campbell. And she's a funny one, because she was a very good journalist. She was well connected. Her grandfather was the British press lord, Lord Beaverbrook.
What a name.
Yeah. And Mailer, one of the things that people don't know, they would know from reading my biography, is that he grew up with this notion of the gentleman hero, of the English gentleman who has a certain code of conduct. People think of him as a brawler, but his father, Barney, South African father, was very snappy dresser, a lot of style. He was a bookkeeper, which you wouldn't think would go with those fancy clothes. And he was also a gambler, lost a lot of money.
And what happened to all those fancy clothes in this movie? Because like Mailer, it's some of the worst outfits I think I've ever seen on a human being. Like, he does not make a good biker daddy.
No,
type.
No. I don't know where they got that stuff, but the film in that sense is a vanity project. He's got the money to make it, and he's going to make. So in that respect, I know a lot of people would just dismiss what he's doing as a bunch of nonsense. But usually with Mailer, there's a real point to it, a seriousness to it, even with all the chaos and craziness.
Right. He's not Henry Jaglom, where he's just sort of like, all right, I'm going to film everybody talking about food for 2 hours.
Yeah. No, it's a little more than that. And I think he did think, like Larry David, he thought out many of the plot elements beforehand. But yeah, a lot of it is certainly spontaneous.
And so this was
not worked out.
Oh,
yeah.
So this was his third film. What made him interested in making movies? Because he was doing very well as a writer. Like, he just won the Pulitzer Prize.
Yes.
Usually people that are doing that well don't need a second job. But
in a later interview, I'm sure this is an interview after Maidstone. I can't remember what question he was asked, but I remember his answer. He said, if I were giving advice to a young person today, it would be not to be a novelist, but to be a filmmaker. The culture has shifted, and writers simply aren't as important as they used to be. And therefore, if you've got some talented director to write scripts and so on, you're probably better off going in that direction. So I think beginning in the 60s, he sees where the culture is going. And that's one thing about Mailer too. He always wants to be part of the action. He always wants to be relevant in some way. When he goes to the March on the Pentagon, it's a funny book, The Armies of the Night, because he does say, you know,
that was 68. That was like 2 years before Maidstone.
Yeah. He's a World War II vet. He doesn't feel he has anything to prove in terms of marching, and yet when people start calling up and saying, "You really want to miss this?" he can't resist. He doesn't want to go to jail. He says that. You know, he doesn't want to do the things that Abby Hoffman and other radicals are doing, but at the same time, he can't resist. It's like this feeling about Ginsberg and the Beats. You know, he's not a beat poet, but people are reading the Beats, so he's got to know, you know, something about the Beats and beatniks and hippies and all the rest of it. He's constantly reinventing himself, which goes back to the different accents too. You know, why he marries an English woman, because the sense of royalty is important to him. The idea that gentleman hero. I'll tell you a funny story about Mailer as the gentleman and the brawler all in one go. He had poodles. He had 2 poodles, big ones, the big poodles, and he would walk them in Brooklyn. So he's walking these 2 poodles one day, and a couple of guys are watching him, and they're starting to make fun. Look at this guy with 2 poodles. And they start saying things, you know, like he's a fag or something. They use all these epithets. And Mailer, you know, starts to get upset. And finally, he challenges one of the guys to a fight. And after he challenges one of the 2 guys to the fight, he says to the other guy, "Would you hold those poodles while we fight?"
Oh man!
I think absolutely epitomizes, you know.
Right. Well, my older sister met one of his kids when she was in college, and the kid mentioned he had, apparently in his later years, there was an entire room of his house devoted to Lego train sets.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah, he did a Lego sculpture that was in his living room for years. A huge sculpture, which they had to take apart. You know, when he was moving out, spending more time in Provincetown than New York. Yeah. His degree was in engineering. He was an engineer, aeronautical engineer of all things at Harvard. Even while he was, you know, had these ambitions to be his writer, because his parents said, "Normie, you know, you gotta have a real profession to fall back on. This writing stuff, we don't know if it's going to work. We support you, but you better have something else." So he studied, because as a kid, you know, he made model airplanes and he was interested in flying and so on. So he decided, okay, aeronautical engineering. Yeah, curious. So if we get back
so interesting, because like the engineering thing, like Pynchon was doing the same thing almost at the exact same time.
Yeah.
Except for like Pynchon has almost the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Well, I guess they both have kind of like unorganized speech pattern. I don't know how Thomas Pynchon speaks, but if the books are any indication, he's probably jumping around a lot in conversation.
I wonder, yeah.
But you were about to say something.
I was just going to say that, you know, I was thinking it was bringing us back to Maidstone. On the one hand, you know, he's the risk taker. He's daring, and then the real daring one is Rip Torn. You know, who really, you know.
I mean, he looks maniacal. He's like doing a better Jack Nicholson than Jack Nicholson ever did. Like Ron and I were saying that he would have made a great Joker in a Batman movie.
Yeah, that's true.
And Norman Mailer, we also say, in the hat and suit that he was wearing, he'd also make a good Penguin.
It's true.
Oh yeah, like the Batman Returns with Tim Burton. Like you could totally imagine him doing the whole Danny DeVito. Yeah, and he's kind of like, the voice would work perfectly. Yeah, if you just add a fewer Ron's quacks there.
Yeah, that's right.
What was the reception to him as a filmmaker? I mean, I was surprised. I didn't realize he made films.
You
know, for his books.
Yeah. You know, there wasn't a widespread reception because it's not like these films got feature film distribution. It was sort of like Susan Sontag, one of my other subjects, who made films as well. Although Mailer's, I think, are, with one exception, Mailer's films are better than hers. He really.
Oh, I didn't even know Susan Sontag made movies.
Oh yeah, she made 2 in Sweden. Her best film actually is a documentary called Promised Lands, which is available on DVD, which is, I think, quite an interesting film. The 2 Swedish films are like Degrade Bergman. Yeah.
So it's like Woody Allen in the early 80s.
Yeah, worse than Woody Allen.
Worse, wow.
Much worse than Woody Allen, yeah.
Wow, that's... Yeah. I might have to watch this now.
Yeah. How do we get onto this?
Well, Ron asked what was the reception.
Oh, the reception.
And I'm guessing like this played probably in Los Angeles and New York for like a week or two, the same kind of places where they were showing like Paul Morrissey movies and stuff like that.
Yeah, as far as I know, it didn't get much more distribution than that. People who were interested in Mailer covered the films, but I think like Sontag's films again, Mailer's films had no discernible impact on filmmakers, as far as I can see. It related more for most people who are interested in Mailer to what he was doing as, in a sense, an author cultivating his persona, and film was now another way to do this.
I'm jumping back to, you were talking about the his accents.
Yes,
and accents that he would use. How did people respond to that? Because he might be talking to the same person, and suddenly one time he's got a Southern accent, and the other time he's got the English accent, and
well,
also,
people, yeah.
Oh no, go ahead.
There were different reactions. Some people concluded this is someone who doesn't have a stable self, a core identity, and is just trying out these different moves, different speeches. He had a good friend from Arkansas, Francis Gowaltney, who also had ambitions to be a writer, who they became friends when they were in the Army at the end of the Second World War. And Gwaltney's a really interesting character. He appears in all the Mailer biographies because he was important, and Faulkner wrote to him and visited him and so on. I think he saw an aspect of Mailer that a lot of other people didn't, maybe because they did serve in the armed forces together. I think Mailer grew up with a deficit in his own mind, a void. He was never particularly interested in his own Jewish background. He didn't deny being a Jew. He wasn't ashamed of being a Jew, but he wasn't interested in being Saul Bellow or Philip Roth or Bernard Melville, the writers of his time. That's why I think he gravitated to this idea of the gentleman hero, in a sense, because it brought him out of his own culture. And I think that what he admired, just take the Southerners, first of all, and you can see this in the Southern character in The Naked and the Dead, is a sense of comfort with the self, with yourself, that he saw in many Southerners, the down-home quality of it. And for a kind of nervous, edgy kid coming from Brooklyn, he admired that kind of composure and just, that Southern drawl just seemed, unlike some Northerners who make fun of that drawl and associate it with stupidity, he didn't. He saw it as a sign of strength, as he did with the Irish too. his Irish characters are characters that he greatly admires, and so for him, I think slipping into different accents is at least in part coming to terms with his own emotions when he's feeling, hostile or is trying to command a situation. Those come in handy, and he's one of these people who just love to mimic accents, who love that aspect of things. It's one of my other biographical subjects. Walter Brennan was just brilliant at that. I mean, he could do a really good Gary Cooper, John Wayne, all the big stars that he starred with. In fact, Walter Brennan once called up the producer Samuel Goldwyn. Gary Cooper was under contract to Goldwyn, and using Goldwyn's accent, Brennan called up Cooper and just told him, "You're fired. Your career's over."
Oh man!
And I think I'm attracted to characters like that. My background is as an academic, but it began as an actor, and biography is attractive to me because you really are trying to get inside a role, trying to figure out how someone else thinks and behaves. And I think that's true with Mailer too. I mean, he was a lifelong member of the Actors Studio, really gravitated to the acting personality. I think that's one of the big misses, in a sense, that people don't get about Mailer. When his Marilyn Monroe book came out, they thought it was opportunistic and it was misogynistic and in a sense not serious. And that's one of his most serious books. He's really interested in her. Yes, of course he finds her sexually enticing, but he's interested in that acting personality. Or put another way, acting is eroticism to him. I mean, that's really part of his shtick.
And I think like the whole notion of acting as the projection of a cultivated persona versus the traditional notion of acting, and I think that they came up in the he wrote an essay on Madonna that
That's right.
had us read, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it's like a very appealing construct. Because he doesn't seem to have a stable sense of self. He keeps going in and out of these accents. He has all these different sides to himself that he can't quite reconcile. It's sort of like he's almost like taking the assimilation thing one step further, because I feel like most texts about assimilation, especially like Jewish assimilation, the 60s and 70s, like the whole Shiksa complex and all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's usually like fixated on one specific thing. Like Woody Allen is obsessed with these women from the Midwest because they seem to project some kind of mythic lack of neuroticism. And Mailer just sort of jumps ahead to the postmodern construct of it, where it's just sort of this this kind of toy chest of different cultural signifiers that he can kind of juggle in different moments without necessarily being that deeply attached to any of them.
There's another answer to Ron's question about the accents. I think it has something to do with control and power. I think growing up as a Jew, Faulkner's
childhood as a Jew coming out.
Actually, I was going to make a Mailer Faulkner comparison in a second. Mailer felt marginalized. In his mind, growing up, Jews didn't have power, and of course, it's coming out of the Holocaust. One of the things he said is that as soon as Hitler took power, his mother told him it's over for the Jews. She knew right away. His mother was very, very smart and very astute and knew exactly where Hitler was headed. And I think Mailer therefore identified and projected and looked for examples of this power and sense of control And I think that's true with a lot of my biographical figures. They invent a persona. Sometimes they take a new name. Like Rebecca West was born Cicely Fairfield. And she said at one point, you know, they might as well have named me Thistledown Dewdrop. You know, no one's going to take me seriously as a writer. So she took a character from Ibsen, Rebecca West, as her identity, her pen name. And Faulkner, who never made it out of flight school in Toronto, paraded around like a wounded aviator. And somebody in Hollywood called him a professional Southerner. Susan Sontag, that's aura, you know, that's a created persona.
Well, she got like married, had a kid, and then just sort of decided I'm reinventing myself 2 days later.
Exactly.
And that's like a pretty extreme.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like a Tom Waits song or something, right? Like the guy's sick of it. He burns down his house and then he drives to a different city.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Burning your bridges. Yeah, for sure.
And I think that brings us to an interesting, because a lot of your biographical subjects, I think there's enough of them now where you should probably do like an Avengers style crossover of all of them in one book to kind of culminate the saga. But maybe that's why I'm not a literary editor. But many of them are major figures in 20th century feminism, and then there's Norman Mailer. And I think it's interesting how you're coming into the appeals, because like from the, you know, if you're just reading the bibliography,
yes,
it almost looks like a prank that there's 2 Norman Mailer books in there. And I guess, how did you, I mean, I'm sure like Mailer was in the culture, he was on TV a lot when you were younger, but you know, it's like a pretty big commitment to write a biography about somebody. What made you think like, this is the guy I got to write a book about?
Well, I had done a dissertation. Now I can actually say the name. I had done a dissertation on William Faulkner, and I was looking at the next generation of writer. Who was it going to be? And so I was looking around, and as I said, my background was in acting. Didn't grow up a Marilyn Monroe fan. I remember seeing as a child Some Like It Hot, but didn't have pictures of her, that sort of thing. Wasn't a fan. And then I picked up Mailer's biography of Marilyn, and I was intrigued with that book and with Armies of the Night, and the persona in Armies of the Night, and started to delve into that to try to understand. And by the time I had turned to Mailer, I had done this dissertation. I didn't write the biography of Mailer till I had written biographies of Monroe and Lillian Hellman, and Martha Gellhorn. So Mailer seemed almost like a natural. Also, I was living in Brooklyn, and I knew some of his friends. I didn't know whether he would cooperate, whether he would sit for an interview. He did consider it, but he had an authorized biographer, and he didn't. He never did sit for an interview. We did correspond.
With biographers, is that a big thing? Like exclusivity? Is there like a monogamy?
Well,
like you're kind of seeing your side piece biographer, and the other guy gets mad.
It depends. Yeah, I never get mad because I think all subjects are up for grabs. You know, I don't own any subject. So if someone is doing a biography on the same subject that I'm doing, I don't, it's competition, obviously, but it's not a rivalry in the sense that I dislike that person or think they shouldn't do it or something like that. In fact, when I did the Hellman biography, there was another biographer who she ultimately abandoned her work. In fact, she turned it over to me, but I didn't know that when I started that would happen. So that doesn't concern me. But with Mailer, I felt I knew something about the work. I understood something about this persona that's created, because that's what acting had been for me, in a sense, creating a persona. I had a tremendous sense of power in high school. when we did a production of The Man Who Came to Dinner, and I played Sheridan Whiteside. He's never off stage. Boy, did I like that. And so I'm gravitated to characters who are like that. Susan Sontag never wanted to be off stage. Mailer always wants to be the center of attention. Faulkner, in his own way, also wanted to be the center of attention. The interesting thing with Mailer, and he never told me this, about maybe 5 years after the first Mailer biography was published, my first Mailer biography was published in 1991, I went to Hawaii and gave a talk at the Center for Biographical Research. And the head of the journal Biography, which is where I had published an article on Mailer's biography of Marilyn. This is that came out in 78. And the Mailer biography was published in 1991. And when I wrote that article in 78, I had not at that time contemplated doing a biography of Mailer. And I gave this talk at the Center for Biographical Research, and the editor of the journal Biography, George Simpson, said, Mailer visited Hawaii. There's this state legislator who he has been friends with for years. And so Mailer visited the Center for Biographical Research at the University of Hawaii. And to Simpson's surprise, Mailer knew this academic journal Biography. Maybe 300 people read that journal. Why would Norman Mailer know biography? And Simpson said, how do you know my journal? And Faulkner says, because you published an article by this guy Rollison, who wrote the best thing that's ever been written about my Marilyn Monroe biography. I had no idea. Mailer never told me. I went ahead and did a whole biography of him. He was one of these subjects who, although he didn't sit for an interview, he didn't tell anybody not to talk to me. He didn't stand in my way, but he felt loyal to his authorized biographer. And so we didn't do an interview.
And did you ever meet him in person?
Never met him. I went to several events where he gave talks, and just as I did with, although I actually met Sontag, I never actually met Norman Mailer. We were in the same room several times, but we never actually met.
You know if you read your biography of him?
I don't. That's a good question. There is somebody to ask, J. Michael Lennon, who was very close to Mailer and has written the most recent Mailer biography. And although I've met Mike Lennon several times, I've never actually asked him that. We had an interesting exchange because in my Mailer biography, I interviewed a woman who was a literary assistant of Mailer's. And she told me how he wrote The Executioner's Song about the murder of
Gary Gilmore.
Yeah. And what she told me is that he dictated the book to her. And I said, why did he dictate the book to you? And she said, because the voice was so important in the book. And when I met Mike Lennon, he said, that part about the execution, I didn't know that. That was news to me. Mailer never said that. So I think there is something about all of the subjects I choose, whether that subject acknowledges me or not, and some of them were alive while I wrote about them and some didn't. I've always felt that there was some personal biographical connection between myself and the subject. And that there's something about the subject that relates to something in me that makes me feel, whether it's an illusion or not, makes me feel some special bond with the subject. It has nothing to do with liking the subject. I don't have to like the subject at all. They just have to be a good subject.
Have you ever had a subject that you didn't like?
Sontag comes the closest.
She
was a real, as they say, piece of work. And I did that with my wife. My wife came out of it just absolutely hating her. Actually, both of us met her. We were teaching in Poland in 1980, and she couldn't have been lovelier. I had a wonderful conversation with Sontag. And even then, because I hadn't written any biographies, never thought I'd be writing her biography. But my one contact with her was entirely positive. But she did everything to kill the book that she could. She really tried to stop us doing the biography. But my wife is a lawyer, and we went in telling the publisher, there's nothing Sontag can do in terms of threats. You can't scare us. We know that this is like working on a mob figure, and we're ready.
Well, like working on a
mob figure.
On a mob figure, Jesus.
Because what she did is she put out the word on us, and people started feeding her stories about us that were entirely untrue. There's a biographer, Benjamin Moser, who again he's done the most recent biography of Sontag, and he had a story in the book about my wife Lisa and I barging into Farrar Straus, Sontag's publisher, and trying to badger the head of the firm, Roger Straus, into an interview. And he had this in his galleys. And we wrote to the publisher, my wife and I, and we said, this isn't a he said, she said thing. This is an event which never happened. We've never been inside Farrar Straus, let alone badgered Roger Straus. And if anyone knew anything about Roger Straus, they would laugh, because this guy was so tough. The idea that we could intimidate him was just ridiculous.
Yeah, like the idea of you strong arming somebody is like really hard to imagine.
How could that possibly work? That's not how a biographer has to ingratiate himself or herself, or at least be enticing in some way. You don't threaten somebody, and so the lawyer called us, that is the lawyer from Harper. They were publishing the Sontag biography, and said, well, the author has notes, he interviewed people at Farrar Straus. I said, I don't care who that. I said, the biographer did not talk to us. And we would have told him flat out, it just did not happen. And there were 2 or 3 other stories like that. We went round and round with this, and they knew my wife was a lawyer too. And she wrote a very good letter. And they finally took it out. They took the whole thing out of the book because it was just absurd. And how he couldn't see that, and why he didn't check with us. I mean, if someone told me a story like that about you or anybody else, I wouldn't just put it in a book. I'd find out, what were the circumstances? How could this have happened? It was just crazy.
I'm like taking a mental note now that the next woman I date should be a lawyer. Sounds like there's a lot of advantages.
When I talk to biographers and they ask me for advice, I say, marry a lawyer. It helps.
Right. That's the moral of the episode, folks.
Yeah.
If you only take away one line here.
My advice to you, yeah.
So oh, no, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just making noise into the void.
Okay. So you've written a lot of biographies about a lot of people. Very, very different people.
You might be next.
Yeah. Hey, so, not much to say about my life, but sure. How do you do it? There's a lot of.
How do I do it?
How do you do it?
You see, part of how I do it is people will sometimes come up to me and they'll mention somebody who is a good subject for a biographer. It doesn't matter who it is. And they'll say, you should write about so-and-so. And I have to tell them, it's just not the way I work. I don't pick somebody and say, oh, that's interesting. I don't even pick somebody and say, oh, there's a market for that, or I can get a book contract for that. It again goes back to this organic feeling that there's something about this person that speaks to me, that I can, in some sense, live vicariously through this person. That was true with a subject we haven't mentioned, Dana Andrews. Very fine actor and really a movie star in the 1940s. And what attracted me to him was that he went to California in 1930 in the Depression. He ended up like my father, pumping gas. He took singing lessons, acting lessons, and for 10 years tried to get a Hollywood contract. Finally got some acting roles at the Pasadena Playhouse, and a Samuel Golden Age discovered him. I couldn't do that. In other words, I started out in summer stock. I started out to be an actor. And by the age of 20, 21, I realized I'm too middle class. I'm too bourgeois. I can't, I won't last. I won't, if it's 10 years, I'm not going to be able to do it. I saw actors with families who could just barely scrape by. And I thought, I can't do that. So biography was a godsend for me. So when someone says, you've done all these different subjects, how, for instance, someone in the Wall Street Journal reviewed my Rebecca West biography and said, how could someone who wrote a biography of Marilyn Monroe write about this literary figure, Rebecca West?
Right.
And what I would say is the thing that connects all these people is me. In other words, there's something in all these different people who reflects some aspect of me or something that I wish I had followed through on. And therefore, I want to find out more about them and know about how they did it.
So there's almost an autobiographical element throughout and it sounds like you probably learned a lot about yourself going through this process of seeing like kind of mirror, or not mirror image, but like kind of alternate reality versions of what could have happened at different points in your life.
There's a book called The Art of Biography, which is, it's by Paul Murray Kendall, very good biographer, did a wonderful biography of Richard III. And he says there, every biography is an autobiography. The curious thing about biography, of course, is that someone who wants to read a biography of whoever it is, they're not, if the biographer starts talking about himself or herself, you might very well get annoyed because you say, I want to read about Winston Churchill. I don't want to read about CARL ROLLYSON. So the autobiography is there. It's like, you read a novel and let's say it's a first person narrator. Of course, you're going to learn things about the narrator. But in a biography, it's very hard to do that. Now, I've done it a couple times, the same way that Boswell did it. I did a book called A Private Life of Michael Foote, which is about Michael Foote, who was a literary figure, but a political figure. He was leader of the Labour Party. He ran against Margaret Thatcher and was badly beaten by her in 1983. I got to know him because he was a friend of Rebecca West, and we became friends through that. And I did a biography of his wife, who was a documentary filmmaker, Jill Craigie. And in the course of doing the biography of Jill, who had died, and I wanted to do her biography, and Michael said, yeah, go ahead. I got to know Michael so well. I had over 100 hours of him on tape. And this is the day when it was tape. It wasn't digital. It was, audio cassettes.
It wasn't on giant floppy disks?
No, it wasn't on floppy disks. It was audio cassettes. And I thought, wow, I'd done this biography of his wife, but I could do like the life of Samuel Johnson with Michael Foote. I could do these conversations between me and him because he just told me all kinds of stuff, funny stuff, interesting things. He was evasive about some things. He had had affairs. I talk about how I got him to talk about his affairs. So it's a back and forth between him and me in the book. Well, you almost never get to do that in a biography unless you actually do know the subject. So I did it that way. With the Hellman book, what I did was I couldn't really do that because I certainly didn't know Hellman. She was dead by the time I started writing the biography. But there are some passages in the book where I take excerpts from my interviews. For instance, I interviewed her lawyer, Ephraim London, and I do it like a play. I have him speaking and I speak, and him speak and I speak. I just do this for part of a page, just to give the reader a flavor of where did all this material come from? How did he get Ephraim London to say this? That sort of thing. So I did that occasionally. Or in the Martha Gellhorn biography, I did a prologue where I talk about she doesn't want this biography done. She's opposed to it. And I'm in Wales on the road trying to find her house. And I talk about the various stops I make, asking for her whereabouts and this, and then getting on her property and wondering if she's going to come out and give me hell and so on. So I give the reader some sense of what does it mean to do an unauthorized biography, not just unauthorized, but where the subject is, openly hostile and trying to stop
on the
people
edge.
doing it. Yeah. So biographers do this around the edge. in a preface, a forward, a prologue, and things like that. But except in, where Boswell knew Johnson or Carl Rollison knew Michael Foote, it's hard to get that into biography, but it's there. It's there in all the books. And I think a lot of biographers feel this way.
Did you ever consider writing an autobiography, or is that like a very different kind of thing?
Yeah, I've considered it and I've come close. I've done a book called Confessions of a Serial Biographer. And that goes chapter by chapter about, for instance, with Sontag, talking about how my wife and I did the proposal, what the reaction was. One of the interesting things about the Sontag biography, that's another biography that it was published in 2000, and then my wife and I revised it and it was published again in 2017. And what happened was her UCLA archive was opened up. We had no access to that. We had access to an archive at the New York Public Library of Ferrer Strauss, which was very useful and became the bedrock of the Sontag biography. But now her UCLA archive was open. And then I found out she had a file on me, on my wife and I. So that becomes part of the biography in a natural way. Here's my subject who's studying me and who's getting her friends to report to her and where we've been and what we've said and what we've done. And that's when they start making up things. Like
was that the moment you knew you'd made it?
Yeah, I guess so. One of her friends, Ned Polsky, writes to him and says, because he grew up with her, he was a childhood friend of Sontag's, and he says, Rollison tried to get me to talk to her, and I said, well, I just couldn't without your permission. And then he says, and boy, was he pissed, which was just ridiculous. Even if I was pissed, I wouldn't let him know it. So the file was just hilarious. So I put that in the revised edition because I felt it was part of the story. It told you something about her, how she wanted to believe these things. One of the things she said is, oh, this Rollison is terrible. He's done subjects like Marilyn Monroe and Muhammad Ali. Well, I hadn't done Muhammad Ali. I mean, she didn't even know what books I had written. She was just going on, the most wild hearsay. That's one of the interesting things about biography is even very sophisticated literary people have no idea either how to read biography or how it gets done.
And so why was Sontag, was she just like an intensely private person?
No, well, she was, I guess you could call her intensely private. She had a persona to protect. And the subtitle of the biography is The Making of an Icon. And it's about how she made herself into this figure. It's like that Wizard of Oz scene when you get to see who's turning the wheels. She didn't want us to see her turning the wheels. She wanted it she told this wonderful story about how with her first novel, The Benefactor, she went to Ferrer Strauss, she said, not knowing anybody. And she walked into Ferrer Strauss and she put this manuscript on the desk there and said she hoped some editor would look at it. And not Roger Strauss, but Robert Giroux, the other partner. She told the story at a pen meeting, and the minutes were there, so I had it for the biography. She told a story about how she just left this manuscript, and then she heard from Robert Giroux, and he liked the novel, and he wanted to publish. It was like a fairy tale. Every writer's dream. You could just walk into a new publisher, slap down your manuscript, and a couple of weeks later they say, we want to publish your book.
Yeah, that doesn't, I know from experience that doesn't work.
That usually does not, I would say, work at all. Anyway, what happened was, and this was
trick is you got to put some glitter with it.
Yeah.
Bag of glitter.
This is amazing. This was in the New York Public Library. Ferrer Strauss had turned over a lot of files to the New York Public Library, to their archive. And in the archive was a letter from Robert Giroux, the guy that she said, the partner who had, just picked them essentially out of the slush pile and decided to publish it. And he wrote this very funny letter. He said, Dear Susan, he said, I'm thinking about writing about the first books of writers that I've edited. And he said, you know that story you told at Penn about, just leaving your manuscript and then my picking out? He said, gee, I remember this differently. I remember you were coming into the office and he said, you were dropping names. One of the names she dropped was Jason Epstein, very famous New York publishing editor. He established Anchor Books, for example, at Random House. I mean, he was involved with New York Review. I mean, he was just, as big as anybody in publishing today in terms of, clout and influence. If Jacob Epstein said to you, you gotta publish this book, you'd at least look at it, if you were Robert Giroux. So she dropped this big name on him. That's what happened.
And did Brian Epstein have any idea that she existed?
No, she was this young writer who came in, but she had a calling card. You see, she had gone to and the other thing she didn't want us to talk about was how when she hit Manhattan in 1959, she was going to all the parties. She was working these parties. She was getting her list of people. She was trying to get the important names so that she could get her foot in the door. She was networking. Is what nothing wrong with that, but she didn't want anybody to know that. She wanted to be that out of my greatness was just recognized by this New York publisher without any intervention. And so she didn't want Rollison and my wife Lisa Paddock coming along and say, well, it wasn't quite like it wasn't quite like that.
Well, that's like musical acts and actors and stuff who seem like an overnight success, but actually, they've been pounding the pavement for years and years.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, Marilyn Monroe becomes a huge star, but actually she's been in smaller films for.
And Ron definitely wanted to ask you a few things because Ron just finished. Sure. I was not part of this project, but he watched every single Marilyn Monroe movie, I believe, in order.
Not in order.
That's dedication.
Not in order. Okay.
I did this with a friend of mine, actually, who's been on the show a few times. And online it was great. But we even watched Scudda Hay and Green, Wyoming. I have a copy of The Fireball. But here's the most important question.
Okay.
In Green Grass of Wyoming, is she the woman in the green dress at the square dance?
I can't
trying to figure out who she was.
Yeah.
Who was she?
Well, I can't say for sure. It might be they would stick in young lovelies like that into scenes, and I really can't say for sure. I don't know.
All right, darn.
Yeah.
Okay. If anybody listening knows that, Ron has asked me that question at least 5 times.
Yeah. No, I never was able to track anybody down who could verify that kind of thing, unfortunately. Yeah.
It was fascinating to watch.
Yeah.
Because I always, I think of her and her persona as a blonde bimbo there, for lack of a better term. And she's not. That was just a character that she played in a few movies.
It was a character she played. In fact, what I like to say to people when I give talks about Marilyn Monroe, about, I subtitled the book "A Life of the Actress," and that's another biography of mine that I've revised and updated because new material keeps coming out. But the basic point is still the same. I put it this way. Suppose someone came to an actor and actress and said to them, we'll make you a star, but you're going to play within a very narrow range of characters, whether they say dumb blonde or sex symbol or whatever, it doesn't matter, but it's going to be, you're not going to be Meryl Streep. You're not going to do, all these different roles and accents and so on. It's going to be, and yet your task, your role as an actress is to make what other people will think of as stereotypes come alive. make them different somehow. That was her job. Nobody in Hollywood ever said that to her. In fact, nobody in Hollywood gave a damn. The gossip columnist, Sidney Skolsky, who was as close to Marilyn probably as anybody, especially in her early career, said no one knew more about what went into a Marilyn Monroe picture than Marilyn Monroe. He really understood the kind of preparation she made for her roles. Mm-hmm. And I would just, for the scoffers or people who want, something very specific to hang on to, if you look at Bus Stop, and then you look at The Prince and the Showgirl, I think you'll see what I mean. When you look at Bus Stop, she's playing an introvert. And when you look at the vocabulary of gesture, the way everything is a movement into the body, everything is internalized in the character she plays in Bus Stop. And then you see her in The Prince and the Showgirl, where it's all external. She moves from side to side in the frame of the film, and it's all about extensions, the way she extends her arm. At one point, she extends her arm and knocks over Laurence Olivier. I mean, she was very strong. She worked out. She worked, beginning in the late 1940s, she worked out in the way that most female actresses did not do. She saw bodybuilders on Catalina Island, and she said, that's for me. She had a running regimen. She did all kinds of things to prepare for her roles. So the idea that somehow it's accidental or it's just her looks or something, you don't become Marilyn Monroe by accident. It just doesn't happen that way.
Mm. Yeah, and it's sort of interesting you bring up the archetype thing, because I think that brings it almost back to Mailer, and probably to Mailer's fascination with Monroe.
That's right.
Is that the acting out of these archetypes? I think it's almost like a religious ceremony within the culture to reify, reestablish. If you can't bring, and I think that's why these people get cycled through so quickly, because if suddenly it stops looking fresh, there's this crisis of belief almost. Because I think celebrity has taken over a lot of the kind of mass mind functions that the church once did, or folklore icons and things like that. And I mean, I guess that's not a common thread through a lot of your biographical subjects, but I definitely think that's more tragically with Monroe than with Mailer. I think Mailer was kind of self-aware of it, although I'm sure Monroe must have come to some kind of self-awareness of what her role was in the culture eventually.
Yeah, I think she did come to some self-awareness about her role, and I think it became increasingly difficult for her to manage what that role was in the culture, as opposed to what she wanted to be, in a sense. It was hard for her to find a way out, and when you become Marilyn Monroe, it's you talk about Mailer using different accents. How do you reinvent yourself once Marilyn Monroe was established? That's really, really tough. Again, if you want to see her before it's all quite solidified, you watch her in a film like Clash by Night, where she plays a working class fish cannery worker, for example, or even in Don't Bother to Knock, which is a drama in which she gets a chance to do things outside her normal range, or even Niagara, where she does play, in a sense, the blonde bombshell, but with an edge that really upset people. She got letters because she played a femme fatale and used her sexuality in ways that you don't associate with the Marilyn Monroe figure. And the studio made sure she never played a role like that again. Wow. Because it was very dangerous, and she knew it was dangerous. She did it anyway. It was a very difficult thing to do. Now, for me, Niagara is just a fabulous movie. Her director, Henry Hathaway, is one of the few. Billy Wilder understood her as a comedic actress, but Henry Hathaway understood that she could have done tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I think in the culture at large, like she ultimately is remembered as a tragic figure. Like I think the
Yeah,
films are remembered as comedic, but she's in that kind of like same era as James Dean, where you could have somebody dies seemingly suddenly or actually suddenly, and then you can have this incredible mass media barrage about it at the time, so it feels like an event that a large number of people have actually lived through. Because
yes.
in some
Same,
sense they
yeah.
have, yeah.
Same for another of my subjects, Sylvia Plath,
Hmm.
who, by the way, was fascinated with Marilyn Monroe.
Hmm.
She saw, she had a dream about her. She wrote about a dream about Marilyn Monroe, and Plath actually referred to Marilyn Monroe in a poem that she wanted published in the New Yorker. The New Yorker did publish it, but they took out the line about Marilyn Monroe.
Oh, how come?
I think that you have to go back to when this happened, late 1950s. People slot culture into categories. They do it less today than they used to do. But there's high culture, there's low culture. Um, Editors at the New Yorker, I don't know this for a fact in this case. I don't know why it was taken out, but my speculation is because somehow it took away from some of the gravity of the poem. As far as they were concerned. You know, people to this day, I actually make the statement in my Plath biography that Sylvia Plath is the Marilyn Monroe biography. And people usually, I shouldn't say usually, but some critics have completely misunderstood what I mean. I don't mean that it's that they're both tragic victims. I mean, they're both full of life. They're both creative, and they both wanted to be known. They both wanted to, like Mailer, they wanted their personas to be part of well, she says at one point, she uses old-fashioned language. Plath says, I want to be the poetess of America, just like Ted Hughes is the poet of England. I mean, she had royal designs, so to speak. I mean, her home in the English countryside is called Court Green. And when I went back and revised my Marilyn Monroe biography, it was after I had done my Sylvia Plath biography. I talk in the Marilyn Monroe biography about how far ahead of her time Sylvia Plath was in seeing Marilyn Monroe as a kind of inspiration. And people today often don't get it. They immediately think victim, they immediately think suicide, and yes, they both are suicides. But there's so much more to that story than just the word suicide. Oh, not to mention that in Plath's case, and as it is in classical culture, suicide can be an act of courage. It's not necessarily an act of cowardice at all.
Right, with Plath, it seemed like it was an act of defiance against the general shittiness of her living circumstances.
That was certainly part of it. Yeah, that was part of it. And I think
because like Ted Hughes sounded like kind of a crappy boyfriend.
Yeah, and Marilyn Monroe too. I mean, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of hatred in there. Some of it is turned against themselves, as it often is in suicide, and a lot of it has to do with self-knowledge and what they thought they could accomplish as opposed to what they have accomplished, even though they've accomplished great things. If you're an ambitious person, it's never enough. I mean, if it was enough, I would have stopped with one biography, right? It's not enough.
Now we have the RBU, the Rollysson Biographical Universe.
Yeah.
So, are you working on any projects now, or you just kind of kicking it back and staying socially distanced?
With the virus and so on, it's difficult to go into archives, and I think the world of archives is I'm done with that. It takes a lot of money. It's very expensive. My wife doesn't like me to travel all the time, and traveling is very difficult now anyway. And I think I pretty much had my say with biography, not with talking about biography. As you see, I'm still talking about biography. That's not going to stop. I'm actually working on a couple of books. One is William Faulkner Day by Day, and one is Sylvia Plath Day by Day. And of course, both books will be failures because I won't be able to find out what they did on every single day of their lives. But there's a value in it. I did a Marilyn Monroe Day by Day book in 2015. This is separate from the biography. And the value of it is it detaches you from narrative. It detaches you from a single story of the subject. And you begin to learn and you begin to notice things when you do it as a kind of diary of someone's life. You begin to notice things that you missed because you were shaping your story of the subject, and that subject has other stories to tell. So that's what I'm trying to do in Sylvia Plath Day by Day and Faulkner Day by Day.
And do you ever find yourself when you have a missing day, do you just put like 8 breakfast ? Or something like that? Like,
I should do that. That's an interesting idea.
I don't think I have the attention span. If I wrote a book like that, it would be 90% just like mundane activities with question marks at the end of them. But
yeah, it's amazing how much I have been able to find there. This is all modeled by Jay Leda, who was a film scholar who became interested in Herman Melville. And he did a book called the Melville Log. And that's exactly what he tried to do. He tried to find out every day he could. He tried to document every day in Herman Melville's life. And that book has become so important to other Melville biographers. No matter how many Melville biographies are written, they always go back to look at Jay Leda to see what they, what's missing or what they might look for. Because sometimes what you put down, you talk about the missing days, that may inspire somebody to look for those missing days.
Right.
It's obsessive.
Yeah, well, I mean, you kind of have to be to do this. So, like, I remember you used to tell me about, like, you go to these archives and you're literally reading through 84 boxes worth of papers. And like, I find it kind of overwhelming when I buy like 40, because I do a lot of used book dealing now. But just buying 40 boxes of books, not reading them, just like looking up prices can be overwhelming.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of having to read 84 boxes and keep it in some kind of order is I didn't get that kind of autism, like,
yeah. What
somebody has to do it.
Yeah, what saves me is going into a biography, because there is this personal connection with the subject. I already know, even if I can't quite articulate it, I know in some sense the story I have to tell. And so when I'm going through all those boxes, that story is helping me to drive what I'm looking for. So I do look at every piece of paper, but not every piece of paper is important to me, which gets me back to the day by day. Suddenly all those pieces, like with the Faulkner Day by Day, I'm going back looking at all the notes and photographs I took in the archives, and I'm putting stuff into Day by Day that I didn't put into the biography. It just didn't fit.
Interesting. I guess like having a good subject for that. I feel like if you did a day by day for just an average person, it would be a pretty depressing book.
Depends on the person.
I
knew a fellow in Michigan when I lived in Detroit, along the river, Jefferson Avenue, along the Detroit River. He had been a civil servant. He had spent his whole adult life working for the city of Detroit. I don't even remember what his job was. And I would just sit and talk to him. And he would remember about the streetcars coming down Jefferson. When I lived there, there were no streetcars. They had ripped out the tracks, sold the cars to Toronto. And not everybody does this. I haven't done it. He kept every restaurant menu that he and his wife, every trip to a restaurant. He kept every theater program. He had documented his life in ways that I haven't done with my own life. And I think I could have used it. His name was Cyril Forbes. I think I could have, if I had stayed in Detroit and kept talking to him, could have done a biography of him. It would be a lot about Detroit and about how the city has changed, but it would be through the perspective of this civil servant. It could have been a good book. Possibly.
Sounds like an interesting book. Are there a lot of biographies like, or I mean, obviously, like celebrities going to draw more biographers, but are there a lot of biographies like that where it's just sort of someone who the person finds interesting but doesn't necessarily have any kind of public presence? Or...
Yeah, academics have a term for it, microhistory.
Okay.
Where you're focusing on a villager or a worker, someone who's has no claim to fame particularly, and you start looking for evidence of that person's life, what their work was, who their friends were, if you can find out. There are often very few documents. I just listened to a talk by Edward Ball, who did this book called Slaves in the Family. It was a big bestseller in his family. He was dealing with his own ancestors, and he's coming out with a book, also someone he was related to, who was a founder of the Ku Klux Klan in New Orleans. And he talks about how difficult it is researching. This person was in the Ku Klux Klan, but he wasn't famous. He wasn't a Klan leader really. He was a pretty obscure person. And about the various techniques he uses to
a lot of like Bed Bath and Beyond receipts.
Yeah, exactly. The French are very good at this. There's a whole school of French microhistory where they're interested in medieval peasants and so on, and finding out about the lives of so-called ordinary or average people.
That's interesting. I guess I don't know, Ron, do you have any final thoughts about Maidstone or and any of these numerous subjects? We got on a real journey this episode, I feel.
We have.
Oh yeah. Well, how's this? I'm glad that we started with Maidstone, but I'm glad that we moved past it.
Yeah.
Right. Like the movie Maidstone, we eventually lost focus on the movie Maidstone, at least in the middle.
And
I'll be honest.
I have one parting word too. I'm still hoping that someone will put me in a movie.
Oh, we could. I don't know. We've had a lot of people on who make movies. We could probably
like Dan.
I haven't made any movies with actors, but
right.
I have made a few movies.
Yes, you have.
With people talking, but well, I guess the second one I got kind of sick of people talking, so I just cut most of that out. It's like footage of driving and like old advertisements, and it's we did an episode about that, but yeah, it's kind of it was a good excuse to live out of my car for a while. Eat a bunch of like food in different places.
What kind of movie? Sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, I would have. I was filling space. There wasn't a happy or satisfying conclusion to that, as you're now realizing, as it hasn't stopped.
No, what I say? So no one's put you in a movie. What kind of movie do you want to be in?
Oh, I'll take anything. I'm desperate.
Yeah.
Well, we could do a video version of this episode.
Okay. You have my permission.
Yeah.
Not that you need it.
It's the length of a feature film.
Yes.
And it's kind of it sort of became that like Avengers like crossover of maybe not all the autobiography subjects, but I think we fit a lot of them in for an hour and a half.
Well, you can send me an announcement about the premiere.
We've only done one video episode so far, so we can make
okay.
the second one.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, it's been fun.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Carl.
Sure, you're welcome.
All right. So we sign off?
Yeah, and do you have a personal website or anywhere you want to point people?
CarlRollison.com. Just my name, CarlRollison.com.
Cool. All right, we'll tweet it out.
Okay.
So cool. All right.
Cool. And I guess this has been Dan.
And this has been Ron.
And this has been a nominee questionable movies with special guest Carl Rollyson talking about the Norman Mailer 1970 movie Maidstone.
And well past that.
And past that, yeah, and a lot of Susan Sontag, a little bit of beef. side of beef, and we'll see you at the movies.
All right. Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.